Well, this morning feels a little bit like home for me. I am from this little island off the coast of Canada called Prince Edward Island, and I'm from a very particular part of the island, from a very particular family. My heritage is what is called Acadian. And so in the early 1700s, Prince Edward Island was a French colony. But it was not too long into the 1700s, actually 1758, that the British came and colonized Prince Edward Island and pushed the French-speaking people out. And so some of those people went to the mainland. Some of those people settled somewhere in the Boston area. Some of those people settled in Louisiana, now known as the Acadian people. And then some stayed on the island in hiding in the woods. And the climate in this area would have meant some really, really tough years while this colonization was going on. In the late 1700s, as the strong arm of the British began to settle, people began returning to Prince Edward Island to find their family members who had been in hiding. And as people gathered there, although they were able to be on the land they were in, that land was still owned by the British. And so the entire island was split up among British people. And so I come from hundreds of years of struggle, hundreds of years of surviving. A lot of my ancestors became fishermen and fishing people to be able to survive and feed their family. And so every summer when I go home to Prince Edward Island, I'll gather like this with my family member. My grandmother had 12 kids, and so there's a lot of us. And Acadians from the area will all gather together and we'll sit around and we'll tell stories and sing songs of struggle to remind us that we've been through some hard things in the past, but we've survived. And we can go through some difficult things in the present and in the future. Today I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the Book of Chronicles. And the Book of Chronicles, if you were reading the Hebrew scriptures as it would be written for the Hebrews, that book would be at the very end of the scriptures. It's actually a recap. It's a folk telling of the Hebrew story. As the Book of Chronicles retells a story that people already know. And so you'd want to wonder why. Like, why is this book so important? Why are these stories so important? Well, to do so, you have to back the story up. See, the Book of Chronicles talks about the glory days. The days when King David ruled, the days when people were free to worship under King David's rule. David was writing these poems and these songs, these folk poems really, that expressed the journey of the people, that gave them a sense of identity. And then his son, King Solomon, is the one who built the glorious temple. If you were to read the Old Testament, you could find this part of the book of Kings and 1 Kings where the details of this temple are so dialed in. Well, Chronicles tells of those days. But as the story goes on after Solomon, there was also the time when the Assyrians came to town. And the Syrian Empire came and captured many of the northern siblings of the Hebrew people and scattered them or brought them into slavery. And then there was when the Babylonians came to town, about 600 years before Christ, the Babylonians came right into Jerusalem and burned the city to the ground and exiled the majority of the people. But as far as colonizers go, eventually the Persians came along. And if you're ranking colonizers, the Persians are the nicer ones. And they allowed people to return to their heritage land. They allowed people to go back to the land that their ancestors had developed on, the land that all their memories came from and their heritage came from. They would still be heavily taxed and heavily ruled and kept at bay, but they were allowed to be there and build their life back up as long as it didn't interfere with Persian ideals. And so in comes the Book of Chronicles, a folk book, telling the stories of the people as they're coming back into their land. But it doesn't look how they remember it. It doesn't feel how they remember it. As they're piecing their life back together, the author of Chronicles begins to tell a story. This year, every August, actually, my family and I will head back to Prince Edward Island. I try to get back every year to participate in my family story participate in my family's culture, and we'll have this gathering, this party every year where my family will gather and the neighbors will gather and we'll sing songs and tell stories. But this year is going to be a little bit different. Some of you may have followed Hurricane Fiona this year as it ripped across the Atlantic. And a lot of the places that I grew up remembering, places that helped form my identity, just don't exist anymore. There's this big yellow boathouse on the coast where my family's from, and every year we go swim off that harbor. That boathouse is gone. That boathouse is wiped away. And so this year we'll go back and I'll see some of the rebuilding that my family and friends have done. But again, we'll gather together and tell stories of the past. Tell stories about how our people have stuck together through many challenging times to build a new future when challenges come again. See, the Book of Chronicles is a summary of God's faithfulness to a rebuilding people. It's reminding people that God's presence in the past means that God is present in our midst today and will continue to be present in our future. It's actually very similar to something we did on Pentecost Sunday, the first Sunday in June. You might remember those who were here. We wrote down stories of God's presence in our past, didn't we? I mean, hasn't our church been through a lot of change over the last 5 years? But hasn't God been so faithful to this community over the last 30 years? And so it's important that we do what Chronicles does sometimes and stop and remember God's faithfulness in the past to give us strength for today and a bright hope for tomorrow, as the old hymn says. This is what Chronicles is doing. There's two really important things to the Hebrew identity. Maybe there's more, but there's two that show up again and again in these Hebrew scriptures. One is that God's presence. It was really important to the Hebrew story that God was with God's people. And the second was God's leadership. It was really important in the Hebrew story that God would lead and guide God's people. And so this is why the Book of Chronicles tells the story of the temple. It retells the story of when Solomon built the temple way back then to give this picture of God's presence right now. And also why the book tells the story and spends a lot of time talking about David and Solomon, two heroes in their midst. What's also interesting about the Book of Chronicles is it doesn't tell the whole story. It's a folk story. It's a revisionist history. It doesn't tell the story of David's rape of Bathsheba. It doesn't tell the story of Solomon taking many foreign wives for himself. It doesn't tell that part of the story. People already know that part of the story. The Book of Chronicles is like a good folk song. It's telling the parts of the story that pull us together and remind us of our identity. It's not about the accuracy of the story, but the identity in which it rests. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, I think, is where this is on full display. 2 Chronicles chapter 7 tells the story of Solomon building the temple. Now, you can decide if this is an exaggerated take or not. I'll leave that in your hands. But 2 Chronicles chapter 7 retells the building of the temple, and it opens up with the temple is built. And actually in chapter 6, Solomon recites this like beautiful poem dedicating the temple. And then in chapter 7, all the people are gathered. And in Chronicles it says that like a fire came from God and smoke filled the temple. And people were so in awe of God's presence, their face was in the pavement. And they worshiped and they gathered together. And that section ends with this huge statement. Yes, God is good. Yes, God's faithful love lasts forever. You think that might be an important phrase for a rebuilding people. And then it goes on to talk about the worship service. It says, then Solomon came along, and get this, he slayed 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. And he says that the musicians were playing these musical instruments, not any musical instruments, but the ones that David created. Can you hear how this is slanting towards God's faithfulness, reminding people of how God was with them then and still today? And again, it ends with this phrase, yes, God's faithful love lasts forever. And then the story goes on and talks about this altar. I mean, this altar that Solomon built that would have been such an important icon for these Hebrew people. But in the Chronicles narrative, it says that this altar where there was this bowl on top of the altar where they would put the ashes from the sacrifices. In the Chronicles narrative, it says that the bowl was too small for the ashes. I mean, there was so much worship and so much sacrifice. The bowl was filling over. And so Solomon stands back and says, let's use the courtyard. Fill the center of the courtyard with these ashes. And then finally, the narrative finishes. Solomon, together with the people, it says they did this for 7 days. And some of us complain about the length of church. And when the 7 days are up, you wouldn't believe this, but the people go, let's do it again. Let's go another 7 days. I mean, that'd be like me finishing my sermon right now, and people start chanting, one more time, one more time. They go another 7 days, and it's a little bit unclear actually when this festival ends. The point was not to be clear on when the festival ends. The point was to be clear about the identity of the people gathered in this temple, responding to God's faithfulness, responding to God's presence with an abundance. Can you imagine being a rebuilding people and hearing this story of God's faithfulness and God's abundance among them as a way to root them as they go through this very challenging season? And Chronicles chapter 7 ends the worship narrative saying, because the goodness of the Lord had shown to David and had shown to Solomon and to the people of Israel, they called it. And the festival was over. Now, my favorite part of this text is what happens next. It then says Solomon went to be with God, a bit of an alone time. And God speaks to Solomon. And no matter what your distractions are in your life right now, I want you to hear what Solomon said. God says this to Solomon after everything that had just gone on. If my people who belong to me will humbly pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. I mean, it's a bit of an unexpected message from God. You'd think that this moment Solomon would go and meet with God, and God would be like, bro, sick worship service, man. Did you really, like 22,000? Like you overflowed the bowl for the ashes? Solomon, wow. Man, Solomon, you are a great leader. But the message to God's people, again, you got to understand the point of Chronicles is about identity. What comes from the mouth of God is reminding them of their identity, that if my people who belong to me will humbly pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear them from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. This is not necessarily a message about evil happening among the people. It's a commitment from God to be present in all of the places he's always been present. That our identity is not in our practice, but our identity is in our posture. Like I think at times, man, there are so many different ways to do church. I love that we have some awesome musicians around here. I love that we have this beautiful property and this building. I love all the ways that we get to practice our faith. But our identity is not rested in the building or our awesome musicians. Our identity rests in this God who is present with us and this God who will consistently show up and be with us through the good times and the bad times. Our identity is not in the answers we have to questions, but who we look to when we have those questions. Our identity is not in getting it all right. Our identity is our willingness to make changes when we recognize when we've done wrong. Our identity is not in a God who ignores us, but a God who hears us. Our identity is not in a God who holds our wrongdoings against us, but a God who forgives us. Our identity is not in a God who has left us or leaves us when things get hard, but joins us in the struggle and walks with us toward healing. It's not in a God who is locked somewhere in the past, but it's in one who promises to be there in the future. This Chronicles moment is a folk song that pulls people together around their identity, saying we must never forget the ways God has been faithful to us in the past, so that we can continue to walk together in faith in the future. Church, we'll hold our practices with great humility. We'll seek God's desires for us and our world, and we will reorder our lives accordingly. This is us. This is our identity. This has been true of the people of God for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. If my people who belong to me will humbly pray, the rituals we move through, seek my face, seeking God's desires to shape our desires. And when that is real, when that is present, that we will turn, us first, will turn from our wicked ways, will reorder our lives in response to God. God says that I'm going to hear you from heaven. I'll forgive your wrongdoings, and you'll see healing in your land once again.